So yeah, anyway, so I encourage everyone to have to raise questions and come with comments after my intro. As I said, football and anti-fascism is a pretty broad topic. I want to look at it from 3 angles. You could look at it from many more. I chose 3 that seem particularly interesting to me as a basis for then possible further discussion. And one has to do with the level of organization of football. So that mainly relates to clubs, the question of whether there are anti-fascist football clubs, and if there are, what makes them anti-fascist, or what is an anti-fascist club. The other one is what you could call football as a political battleground. So that concerns more supporter culture, right-wing, left-wing, fascist, anti-fascist supporter culture, and the political struggle that happens in football stadiums and on terraces and around football clubs and in supporter culture overall. And the third aspect has to do with football as a learning tool. So the question of whether football as a sport can in some way contribute to anti-fascist politics. Before I get to those 3 angles, a few words about why I am here to talk about this to begin with, like what's my personal relationship to football and the topic. So that starts with me having been a very passionate football player and athlete overall as a kid. And when I was 14, I was selected for one of the Austrian talent hubs for young football players. So I grew up in Austria. I now live in Sweden, but my early sporting career, that all happened in Austria. And so I was selected to one of those places where they collected young talents in football that seemed to have the potential to have a professional career. And then when I was very young, 15, I got a contract with a second league team in Austria. So second league football in Austria at the time was semi-professional, and I played with that team for 4 years. And then when I was 19, I basically ended my footballing career for different reasons. Big one was that I had started to be very interested in politics, radical left-wing politics, and some of the ideas and principles I embraced seemed to contradict the experiences I had in the footballing world. But then there were also practical reasons. For example, that it was very time-consuming to play football on that level, and I just wanted to do other things, travel and study and whatnot. But my interest in football never disappeared, and so since then I've been playing football on a grassroots level. I was involved in organizing football events, tournaments, and such. I co-founded an alternative sports club here in Stockholm that mainly focused on football, trained kids in playing football. And I've been writing quite a lot about football because it connects with another passion, I suppose, I have, working with publications. And the first thing that I published that relates to this talk was a pamphlet, this anarchist football manual, which I wrote, I believe it was the year 2005, and that came out of my experiences of living in the US in the early 2000s, where football was embraced by as the favorite sport in various radical communities. I think in the US context, there were various reasons for that. One was that soccer wasn't one of the main professional sports, unlike in most countries in Europe. So it didn't have all of the negative connotations that big professional sports have. So in the US, that's more American football and baseball and basketball. Then the divide between men's and women's football wasn't as pronounced in the US as it is in most European countries. Women's football has a much higher status, and for a long time, football has been seen as an immigrant sport in the US. So nowadays, that's mainly related to immigration from Latin America. So there were different aspects that made it attractive for radical communities, which I enjoyed, and I remember being very excited going to anarchist events and being able to play in a football tournament outside. But then maybe some European arrogance comes through. But when I started talking to people about football, it seemed that they liked the game and they enjoyed playing it, but they didn't necessarily know so much about the history of the game or the culture or the politics, and that's where the idea for this pamphlet came out of. So because I felt like, okay, there's a lot of people here who like the game, but I feel they could maybe do with a little more background information. And then that pamphlet was well received and sold quite a few copies for a publication like that. And when a few years later the publisher PM Press was founded as an offshoot of AK Press, the people there asked me if I wanted to turn the pamphlet into a book. And that's where the book Soccer versus the State, Tackling Football and Radical Politics came out of, which is my main book about football. This was the first edition. There's a second edition that came out in 2019, which is an updated version. There's a few new chapters from the original, I think, 2010 edition. So that's the background to that. And now to those three angles about anti-fascism or football and anti-fascism that I mentioned before. The first one, so level of organization, so football clubs. Why am I adding this? I think because I hear quite regularly people refer to clubs as not necessarily, sometimes as anti-fascist clubs, but also could be left-wing clubs or something. But quite often that's big professional clubs, and that label doesn't necessarily make so much sense for me there, but it does make sense in other contexts. So if we look at this in a historical perspective, when the first sports clubs were founded in the framework of more organized sports in the late 19th century, it was mainly in the context of churches and companies that found sports, schools that found sports to be a useful way, both to entertain, but also to discipline the people. But then quite early on, especially in working class culture where sports became popular, there was self-organization around sports in different social movements, and particularly in the workers' movement. Sports clubs were founded on different principles, on specifically socialist principles, and then especially in the 1920s and 30s, also explicitly anti-fascist principles when fascism became a growing political movement and danger in Europe. I have one photo. You could probably just show this here on the computer if you knew what you were doing. I'm sort of a technophobe, so this is very old school, but I hope you can see this. It says, the banner says, never will fascism score a goal in Red Vienna. Workers, footballers will guarantee that. It's a photo from 1931 when the Workers' Olympics was held in Vienna. Austria was a center of the worker sport movement at the time. And so in that context, I feel it does make sense of speaking of anti-fascist, socialist, anti-fascist sports clubs, because they were based on such principles and weren't involved in as quasi-corporations in professional sports. Very similar developments in Latin America around that time, early 20th century. A lot of clubs were founded on socialist principles. So there, I think it makes sense, and that then picks up again There's a kind of revival, not necessarily of the worker sports movement, but of self-organized sports and sports clubs, also in the radical environment in both Europe and the Americas in the late 20th century. And so you have some, they're also explicitly anti-fascist sports clubs that's then already an overlap to the next chapter when we look at supporter culture, but where neo-fascists had more and more influence on the sporting world and also on football, and especially supporter culture there. So in Germany, Roter Stern Leipzig would be maybe the main example of a club that's explicitly anti-fascist, and that was founded at around the time and is still a pretty successful grassroots sports club, and there are other examples. So there it makes sense. It doesn't make so much sense. The main bigger club that's often referred to as an anti-fascist club is FC St. Pauli in Germany. That, for example, to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the club St. Pauli is just a club. It didn't really have anything to do with anti-fascism until the 1980s, when an anti-fascist supporter culture developed around it. And today, arguably, the club itself is very much influenced by that supporter culture, and some of the people who in the 1980s were involved in creating this supporter culture now work for the club. And so it is certainly a more progressive club than most other professional sports clubs, but it's still very much involved in what you have to do in the professional sporting world. You have to be successful, you have to make money, you have to buy and sell players, and so the label of an anti-fascist club doesn't really make much sense to me. There was also a recent book that came out in England, The Roaring Red Front, I think it's called. It's not called the world's top anti-fascist football clubs, but the world's top left-wing football clubs, I believe, and anti-fascism plays a big role in that. And then they list clubs such as Liverpool and Boca Juniors, and it's not necessarily a bad book if you want to read about. There's the two authors travel around and interview supporters, and that, I mean, it's interesting, but it doesn't to put these clubs in categories, or to put them in categories such as left wing or anti-fascist clubs doesn't make much sense to me. So that's about on the club level. The other angle I wanted to talk about was what as I said, you could call football as a political battleground, and that concerns more the struggles within fan culture. And if we look at that historically, probably have to go to the 1980s, 70s, 80s, when, especially in the UK, fascist groups, the National Front in particular, started to use football stadiums as recruiting grounds, and they became very important in their overall strategy. And so anti-fascists focused on disrupting those recruitment efforts, and with all sorts of different means, including physical means, we're fighting fascists on the terraces. What's also interesting there is that because it seemed politically important far beyond what was happening in football, there were activists involved that weren't necessarily anti-fascist activists, that weren't necessarily very interested in football itself, which I'm mentioning because if you look at supporter culture, and as I said, football as a political battleground, you do enter a sphere of political significance that goes beyond the sport itself. So when people, for example, I don't think there's any particular argument why left-wing anti-fascist radicals who have no interest in sports should have an interest in sports. I mean, if you're not interested in sports, you're not interested in sports. Maybe that's even good for you. I don't know. But if people sort of dismiss sports as something that's generally not important, or maybe even take issue with other radicals being interested in sports, I do think that is politically not useful, because sports are politically very important, since they, for better or worse, engage a lot of people very passionate about sports. One of the main examples always is there are no places in most European countries where as many people gather as regularly as in sports stadiums, and in most countries that's football stadiums, because that's the most popular sport, and that in itself makes it a very political terrain where both society at large is reflected, but where you can also have an influence on society at large. So even if you're not interested in sports, you should be glad that some people choose that as an arena for their political activism. So from an anti-fascist left radical perspective. A comparison I sometimes use, as I said before, I have no interest in technology, for example, but I'm very happy that we have people in radical movements who are, since that obviously the digital world also has become politically highly important. And so that similarly, I look at sports in a similar way, and those in the end very successful anti-fascist struggles in the UK in 1970s and then 80s are one example. If you then continue with that history in the early 1990s, very much coming out of the anti-fascist supporter culture that developed around St. Pauli in the 1980s, in the early 90s, which inspired similar groups in other German cities. In the early 1990s, you have a network that's founded in Germany, and originally it was called Bündnis Antifaschistischer Fußballfans. That was the original name, known as BAF. That's the acronym. And then to keep the acronym, but to still change the name, just about a year later, the name was changed to Bündnis Aktiver Fußballfans, which was controversial among the founders and the membership, but there was a decision made to change the name. I guess some of the original people would to this day prefer the old name, but despite the name change, obviously this network very much came out of the anti-fascist movement, the autonomous left in Germany, and was highly influential in, the German, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, in terms of keeping standing areas, terraces in the stadiums, keeping the ticket prices fairly low, and other aspects that still make the professional game more accessible to working class people. Germany is way ahead of other big footballing nations, especially the UK, and a lot of that is due to the influence of this very well organized left-wing anti-fascist supporter culture that exists there. Then in recent decades, I don't know so much about that. Maybe people in Finland who have interest in the matter know more about it, since they're geographically closer. But that concerns Eastern Europe, where I think there was a lot of far-right recruitment in football stadiums in the 2000s, and resistance by supporter groups and other activists. So I think in the last perhaps 20 years, also in terms of especially quite just physical confrontations of different fan groups, that sort of is maybe the most important region to look at in Europe. But as I said, I'm not that knowledgeable beyond knowing that the clubs that have an anti-fascist supporter base, Arsenal, Kiev, and others. And then the third angle I wanted to take, that was, I think I was talking about football as a learning tool. So that concerns more the sport itself. Like I'm also interested in discussion of whether football as a team sport particularly, but also sports in general, can in any way help with anti-fascist organizing or anti-fascist politics. there are, if you look around, there are some texts written by anti-fascist or anarchist, those are communist football fans who try to make an argument that there's something inherently anti-fascist or anarchist or communist about football because of the aspect that it's a team sport and that you have to work together, and also, but then also if you look at the anarchist interpretation, at the same time there's an element of individual creativity involved. And I mean, I like reading texts like that. They're nice to read. I don't know how far the argument really goes. At the end of the day, sports are sports and they're just games. I think the political significance comes more from how you play and organize them in and of themselves. I don't think you can put them in any particular political camp. But with that said, I do think that again, especially team sports, and then perhaps football, especially because it's so popular and because it's so easy to play, if you focus on, to put it simply, the positive aspects, it can be an important part of also anti-fascist political organizing. So if you stress aspects like the team and the collective aspect, but also sportsmanship and fair play, which it's an interesting discussion. There's some class criticism around that because those principles very much come from an amateur middle class perspective in the late 19th and early 20th century. But me personally, admittedly, I'm a big fan of those principles, and I don't think they're necessarily only attached to amateur middle classes. If you look at the worker sports movement, for example, of the early 20th century, that fair play was a very important part of their interpretation of sport as well. So I think if you focus on those aspects, there is a potential to use football as a tool in bringing people together and foster egalitarian principles rather than hierarchical principles that then might, strengthen far right or fascist politics. Same with nationalism. You can certainly tame that very early on in sports, and I think there are historically numerous examples. Again, you could go back to the worker sports movement, but even just in recent history, and not just in the anti-fascist sports clubs that I mentioned before that are founded, but also in various initiatives, and whether it's in the context, so that's just from personal experience, of also organizing sports among refugee sports events among refugee communities, or it is an easy way to bring people together, and also to allow people to become active themselves in organizing around the topic that they're passionate about and that they like, and where it's easy to connect to other people. In that context, I just recently, it is a completely different project, but we interviewed a person who came from Chile to Sweden in the 1970s as a political refugee under the Pinochet regime, and somehow we got talking about political organizing and one of the and sports, and one of the things the person said was that he was disappointed when he came to Sweden because it seemed that those two aspects were so separate. So there was sports, and then there was political organizing, and that was something completely different. While he grew up in a culture where those two things weren't as different. And as I said earlier, I mentioned in another context that in Latin America in the early 20th century, you had sports clubs that were founded on socialist principles, and often they were called social and sports clubs because the social aspect in the Latin American context of sports clubs was always a bit more pronounced than in most European countries. And this person that we talked to thought that was very important when he was growing up in the context of Also political organizing, because through the sports clubs, a lot of people got their first organizing experiences and then could take that with them also into, and also the principles they learned there, into the political world also, and more specifically in his case, into union organizing, which was his big thing. So yes, I do think, again, I don't think it's as simple as saying that, well, if you look at the true value of football, you will see that it is anti-fascist at its core. I don't think that that's the case, but I do think there is potential in the sport, as in other sports. But again, for particular reasons, football is a very good example because of its popularity and because it's easy to play, where you can make connections to anti-fascist politics. With that, I would end my introduction. Now we've been delayed for different reasons, but I don't know how much time people have. I do have time and would be very happy to hear a few comments or questions about what I said. Thanks for listening.
So hello. This was very interesting, and this reminds me of Finnish history. We had civil war in 1918, and after that practically all sports was organized either by working class organizations or then the white heritage organization. There was also we still see this like Swedish speaking and Finnish speaking organizations, but the clubs are Finnish or Swedish speaking, but there was really like two different sports organizations. And for example, for Olympic Games, we sometimes did not send the Finnish medalists, because Finnish championships medalists, because they happen to be from the working class organizations. So in Finland, it was a very high level organization, not just clubs, but all these two different national sporting organizations, and there was very much this working class or not, and that it was the whites who decided who will be, for example, participating in Olympics or something. Story of this earlier history reminded me of this very much. So do you know some other European country where this went to higher levels than just clubs? And then the second question comes, how about neoliberalism? So some of these old Finnish working class sport people, they tell about when they started, they were really working class cities where there was factory cities, factory towns. There they had their sporting clubs, but that now the logic of sporting has totally changed, because it has become commercialized. So it's no longer that the working class kids after school go to play to free places. But it is very, very commercialized and very much profit-oriented, and this very neoliberal logic. These two questions I would like to hear your comments about.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting questions. The first one, which relates more to the workers' sport movement of the early 20th century. So the countries, and it's interesting you say that, because just from my personal interest in the matter and reading up on things, I am aware of the working sport movement in Finland having been quite strong. And partly I think it is related to what you said about there being a pretty strong divide within the country as a result of the civil war. And you can contrast that, for example, to Sweden, where the worker sport movement wasn't very strong, which might seem strange given the strong social democratic history here. But because of the specific social democratic history in Sweden, that was exactly the reason why the workers' sport movement wasn't very strong, because the Swedish Social Democrats, unlike other social democratic parties in other countries, which were still a bit more radical at the time in the 1920s and 30s, the Swedish Social Democrats were afraid that if you had specific proletarian sports clubs, that would create division within the country, while they were mainly concerned with bringing the classes together in what's called folkhemmet, which I'm sure that most people in Finland will have at least heard about at one point. But if you go, for example, to Austria, the situation was more similar, perhaps, although my knowledge about Finnish history is limited, but it was maybe more similar in the sense that society was more polarized in the 1920s and 30s. So Austria then had its civil war in 1934 between the socialist forces and the conservative fascist forces. And on the socialist side, there was a very in Austria there was a very strong overlap between socialist sports clubs and the Republikanische Schutzbund, which was basically anti-fascist workers' militias, which were founded in the 1920s. So the president of the Socialist Workers' Sports Association was the same person who was the chairman of those militias. So there was a very clear even organizational overlap. And the center of the workers' sports movement really was the German-speaking world. So it was Austria and Germany, also Czechoslovakia. But both Finland and Norway had strong workers' sports movements. In other countries as well. I mean, even in the US, there were clubs that were founded in that context. But all of that history, unfortunately, was really erased then with fascism and World War II. And some of these organizations still exist nominally, also in Austria, but they've never that sort of radical political edge, or radical, at least clear political edge they had in the 1920s and 30s, that disappeared. And if you look at what's left of worker sports movements today, it's, unless you really look into the history and are super interested, that you wouldn't notice that there's any particular difference between these clubs and any other regular sports club, which maybe brings us, that was the sound cut off a little bit during your second question, so I'm not 100% sure if I understood it, but I think what I said starts relating to it. So I think the situation today with also just the community aspects of sports organizing, I think have changed. And I guess, neoliberalism is to blame for everything, so probably for that too. But I do think it makes sense to analyze that process in that context, because there's various aspects, but one is that the communal aspects of sports clubs, even when they weren't explicitly political or left-wing, were very much based on voluntary work. That's where a lot of people, just in small towns, villages, people will put a lot of time, or would be willing and happy to put a lot of time into these communal projects of sports, also other cultural clubs. I think that has to a large degree disappeared. People no longer have time for it, or there are other things that are more interested, especially for young people. There are many more other distractions, things that seem both maybe more attractive and easier. I've just recently been, because I didn't mention that in my introduction, but I do write regularly about sports for Junge Welt in Germany, which is one of the two GDR East German dailies that still exists. And I did a sort of a short research trip in Eastern Germany, especially in that case related to winter sports, but also talking there about people, what the main problem is. Also looking at the history of how sports was organized in the GDR, was that it is very difficult in general to have people involved in sports clubs in the society we live in today. Which then, if you want to look at it from a positive angle, that might also be a reason why there has been a resurgence of explicitly like far left anti-fascist sports clubs developing in the radical milieu, which wasn't so much the case when I started to be political in the 1980s and 90s, but I think this has become more important. And perhaps one of the reasons is because there's an overall lack of these clubs, and I think people on the left realize that that is an important part of political organizing as well, and so there is more self-initiative to found projects like that. So yes, thanks again for the questions.